Welcome to today's edition of Daytime Dialogues. It is really an honor to be able to reach across, I think you refer to it as the pond, to be able to speak with one of the leading rabbis in Great Britain, Rabbi Joseph Dweck, who is really the chief rabbi of the Svardic community in London today in the United Kingdom. He is the senior rabbi of the S&P Sephardi community of the United Kingdom. S&P, I discovered, was Spanish Portuguese along the way. But Rabbi Dweck has a fascinating background. He grew up in Los Angeles. He actually was a member of the Eula Kollel under Rabbi Sauer. He is also the grandson-in-law of the late Chacham Ovadia Yosef. And his mother-in-law is also a very, very prominent person in Israel as well, Adina Bar Shalom. And so Rabbi Dweck has all of these different pieces of the Jewish world within his one background. And we're going to have a lot of fun today, I'm sure, in this conversation. So thank you, Rabbi Dweck, for joining me.
An honor and pleasure. I'm looking forward. Thank you, Rabbi Matan.
So let me just start with the simple thing. How does a boy who grew up in LA end up becoming the grandson-in-law of Rabbi Ovadia Yosef?
Yeah, I ask myself that question fairly often, actually, looking back. Look, I guess I can say that from the time that I was a boy, I guess maybe third, fourth grade, I had this tremendous kavod and love for Rabbi Ovadia, because he came. First time that he came. Well, the first time he came, I was a baby, but from that time that I can remember, he would stay often with my grandfather, who was the president of the Sephardic community there, or one of the congregations, Sephardic Magen David or Magen David congregation, which was originally on Melrose Avenue, which was an interesting, eclectic place to have a synagogue. At the time, it was also the center of the punk rock, regime. But in any case, the Chacham Ovadia was close with my grandfather, and when it came time for me to go to yeshiva, which I had always intended, but I very much wanted to do after high school, it just happened to be that the Rav was opening a yeshiva for that age, for students that age at that time, that year, and so. It's a long story, but essentially I ended up attending the yeshiva, and the now Rishon Zion Rabbi Tzchak Yosef was my Rosh Yeshiva, and he was the Shadchan. And so he, I was 20 years old, and I told him, look, I was there for 2 years, and I told him, look, I think it's time for me to go back and start studying. He said, wait, I have somebody for you to meet. And so that's how it ended up.
And in Los Angeles today, the connections, obviously, with the current Rishon LeZion, Rabbi Yosef, and with his late father, probably is not only very unique, but also creates a different kind of dynamic than I assume has existed in the past with the Sephardic community in Los Angeles and now in London. Is having that close of a connection may have a difference, or is it?
Well, in terms of
just
rabbinate, or in terms of?
Yes, in terms of it all.
In terms of it all. Look, the relationship with Chacham Ovadia Zatzal himself was very important. It was, besides the, simply being able to be close with him and to be mashamish him over many years and being able to see him in personal scenarios, it was extremely helpful to be able to have him as someone to advise with directly. And there were times where it was very important for me either to advise or to have his support in things that were happening. There was a situation in Brooklyn when I was a rabbi in Brooklyn. I was a rabbi in Brooklyn for 16 years, in which there was an eruv, which is always, something that draws attention of many people, in which I had to advise with him quite closely because it was a bit contentious in Brooklyn. And I had asked him essentially if I could translate his tshuva in Yabia Omer into English, because he's matir. He allows an eruv that's made by Tzurat Petach in Yabia Omer, which was contentious. It was contentious. And And he said, yes, so I called him what was going on, and he said, yes, you can translate it, but word for word, mila b'mila, he said, you have to translate that way. And then he called me back after that, and he said, and by the way, when you're writing out the poskim who allow it, number them, because there's many more than the ones who don't. So there's, anecdotes like that, things in which, but genuinely, I mean, as you could imagine, just to be able, Chazal say, shimusha gedola mitalmuda, that to serve and to be engaged personally with a hacham is greater in certain respects than the study itself, and that's because one gets to see the Torah in manifest in various situations in real time, and so that was, I mean, as you can imagine, invaluable.
And in London, how many members are there of the Spanish-Portuguese Quila?
So the Spanish-Portuguese Kehillah is a relatively small Kehillah. I would say we have between 2,500 to 3,000 members. But it's special in many ways. First, it's important because it's the founding Jewish community in the country. It's the oldest community in the country. So there were Jews in the country before the 13th century, but they were expelled. So the resettlement of Jews in the country was essentially by the Spanish and Portuguese Jews in 1656. And they came from Amsterdam into England. It's a long story we don't necessarily have to get into, but because our community was the first community here, we essentially are the cradle of British Jewry. So all of the foundations for Jewish life in this country were essentially established by our Kahal. So we sit at every table. We have here an organization called the Board of Deputies, which essentially is this coalition of all of the various Jewish components in the country that come together to represent the Jews to the government. Because remember, of course, there's no separation between church and state in Britain. So there's a Jewish representation to the government, and that was founded by Sir Moses Montefiore, who was the president of our Kahal in the 19th century. And so all of the stuff that's happened over the years, the S&P has been quite involved with and connected to.
And you succeeded Rabbi Levy?
Yes, Rabbi Abraham Levy.
So Rabbi Levy, when I was in...
He had been in place for 35 years.
No, his family lives right out. Some of them lived right outside of Chicago, and now some do as well. So
is that right?
Yes, so his nieces and nephews were here in Chicago, and two of them were in the yeshiva in Chicago when I attended as well. And I was able to. I taught a class once at the Montefiore, the Smicha program of Montefiore when I was in London. So. So you succeeded his role, and you have that. And in terms of referring to you as a chief rabbi, are you considered that you're the senior rabbi of the S&P? Yeah. Are you considered also a chief rabbi,
for all intents and purposes? Yes, I'm the chief rabbi of the Sephardic community here, and so that means that because the United Synagogue, which is the Orthodox Ashkenazi, organization. Well, there are actually two, but it's the older one. The chief rabbi of the United Synagogue, which is Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, a good friend and colleague, it's a much larger community. I mean, much larger, many more synagogues, by far. And as because of that, the chief rabbi is recognized as the head of the United Synagogue. So I'm a very small constituency. But we sit together and work together on many, many, many things. So yeah.
And what are the primary issues that are facing the S&P Quila in England today? And maybe
there are many. I mean, the obvious, which I know many people share, is dealing with the pandemic. I mean, there's a big issue with regards to the attendance at synagogue and the central nature of the Jewish community in people's lives. Now that people have gotten very used to staying at home on Saturday mornings, got very used to being able to simply connect on Zoom for so many things. Plus, we're not out of the woods. So that is a tremendous challenge, I would say. I speak with the chief rabbi about that often, about kind of how it is that we're addressing those things. But besides that, there are questions with regards to Jewish life in general. There is a high level of of intermarriage. I don't think that it's any higher than the broader, American, Jewish population. But because Britain is small, and I mean, we have a total, they say that we have about 300,000 Jews in Britain. The majority of them live in London and Manchester, and then there's a few, that live on the outskirts. It used to be that many more Jews lived in what they call the provincial towns, but people are moving into the cities. And we're a small group, and it's important for us to be able to maintain a strong core of Jewish life and awareness. So that's a struggle. I say that, though, at the same time, we really do have a wonderful Jewish community with, pretty much everything that you want. I mean, very famous, Limud started here and is very prominent here. The Jewish Book Week that we have here, that's very strong and prominent. So there's a lot of strong, prominent Jewish pride, but we're in Europe, Brexit notwithstanding, and so I think the challenge is very much how it is that we stand, first of all, on this side of the world, where we are, and to consider the issues of anti-Semitism and Jewish continuity and so on. So those are broader things that we deal with. I guess coming from America, feel a bit more. I should also say, coming from Brooklyn for 16 years, which is it's something in its own right. It seems a bit more acute here.
And it's Rabbi Saxzal used to speak about his great success in terms of getting more children into Jewish education.
Yeah.
That it's continued with Rabbi Mervis. Is there a difference between the Svardic population in the United Kingdom and the Ashkenazic in terms of attendance at Jewish schools?
Not really. No, not really. It pretty much is across the board. Those who will send their kids to Jewish schools, I think that the percentages and the level is essentially uniform. I was interested because also coming from America, there are many Orthodox families that still send their children to secular schools. The Jewish day school movement here is much later than the United States. And so there are still, about 10, 15 years ago, the Cheders were still very, very strong. So that's it. I think that it's a high level. One of the interesting things that I found as well is that there was one thing that was lost as a result of the Cheders kind of diminishing in their population, their student population. And that is also, it served as a bridge in connection to the synagogue. And that kind of has severed. And so that also poses another challenge to synagogue life and development.
But if I recall correctly, with the exception of schools like Hasmonean, most of the schools have very minimal Judaic studies within the Jewish schools. It's an hour.
Yeah, I mean, it varies. It varies. Minimal depends. A school like JFS, the Jewish Free School, which is about 200 years old. I kind of call it for American audiences, it's kind of like a public school with a Jewish milieu, It's a bigger challenge because, like I said, there's no separation between church and state. And so the Jewish schools, on the one hand, get subsidies from the government, but on the other hand, have to teach government curriculum. And so that eats out of the day. And so there's it's a big challenge to be able to put in the more robust Jewish curriculum, Judaic curriculum in the schools the way that we might in America.
So when you're confronting the challenges of COVID we're all dealing with, of how to get people back into shul, one of the things we discovered in Chicago is we have this wonderful thing called winter, which is raging outside. And so the tent minyanim.
You have it seriously.
Yeah, so the tent minyanim did not last. And there are people still who have not come back to shul. But it's not as bad as in some other parts of the country where you came from LA. There are still tent minyanim.
Right.
Nice to be outside, even in the winter. In England, were there tent minyanim or they were closed down?
Yes, there were. Absolutely. There were tent minyanim all over the place. But they also had garden minyanim. So they had people, gathering in their gardens. Some gardens adjacent to each other were joining. but yeah, they found all kinds of innovative ways to do it.
So that's one thing we all share. The
Mhm.
intermarriage, unfortunately, and assimilation is something we all suffer from.
Yeah.
Is there anything unique? And I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I was in England. I was teaching for about a week in the various schools. And I discovered on Shabbat, I attended services on Shabbat, and I forgot which synagogue it was. I had never encountered in Chicago what I'll refer to as Posheta Balabatim, people who really didn't know anything, but they came to shul,
Mhm.
and this was part of their cycle. It was something unique I'd never seen
Yeah.
before. Does that still exist in England? Is that still
Yeah.
part of the culture?
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I have a theory on it, which is entirely anecdotal and my own personal perspective on it. But I really think that that is a manifestation of Sephardim being the foundational establishment in the country, because it's always been, you'll see that in Sephardi communities even outside of England. In other words, you
Right.
go to a Sephardi shul and you will see people who are not necessarily shomer much, right? They're not necessarily Orthodox in practice, but they identify as Orthodox. So in other words, when they get married, they're going to an Orthodox rabbi. If they have questions, they're asking an Orthodox rabbi. They consider themselves part of the Orthodox community, even though they may not keep very much at all. But they'll attend synagogue. You know, they'll drive, but they'll attend synagogue on a Shabbat, and they'll go to an Orthodox synagogue. So that's always kind of been part of Sephardic approach to things. And I think that that has just manifested as an English practice. But yes, you definitely have that all over, all over.
See,
Yeah.
I would suggest that it might be a little bit different, that that's the
Mm.
way it always was. And America messed it up.
You think
That by
so?
creating various denominations or streams,
Mm.
all of a sudden we created avenues that were beyond the
Mhm.
push to balabos, where
Mhm.
there were a lot more options. It wasn't an either or, like you'll find.
Yeah,
still,
I hear that. That makes sense. Yeah, they're probably you know, complex
Yeah.
contributions to it, but I hear that.
it's there was a controversy 4 or 5 years ago that you entered into, or that was surrounded you. And
Can't
that-
imagine what you're talking about, Rabbi.
Yeah, it surrounded the question of attitudes towards homosexuality.
Yeah.
But what I found very interesting is that both you and Rabbi Mervis addressed those issues.
Mhm.
Rabbi Mervis addressed it in a curricular piece that he did, which created in the United States some, I don't know if interest or uproar, but something of that nature. And you entered into the fray a bit with one of your lectures that you delivered. It was a serious lecture. I think it lasted an hour and a half or more, trying to explain Jewish attitudes towards homosexuality. I'm just wondering, in some ways, is the United Kingdom's rabbinate more progressive in terms of its willingness to address things?
So
There's
just the question again.
I'm wondering if the rabbinate in the United Kingdom is maybe a little bit more willing to address difficult topics than rabbinate in America, maybe because you have a formal structure. Is there something that the reason why both of you have addressed it in different ways?
It's an interesting question. I'm not sure that they're more willing to address it or more open to addressing it. I mean, you know, it is true that in Britain, things are much more centralized than they are in America. Yeah, so there are formal institutions that have hierarchies, you know, that have to address issues. So that is part of it. I think that that's part of it. And so it's done in a very measured kind of, you know, focused way. Although people criticized me because they said it should have been more measured. But, and also, you know, Rabbi Mervis, he came out with that curricular advice 2 years after I had made that, you know, I had made that I'd given that lecture. I think there is interesting dialogue about things, but I'm not sure that it is necessarily more open. I think that this, like you say, yes, the structures are different. I think the structures are a bit different, and it's more kind of like systematic and thought through. But there are many things that are quite developed in America or done in America that here people are very, very, you know, hesitant to, you know, to discuss. So I'm not sure that I would say as a blanket statement that it's, that Britain is more open to things than America.
So why, when you gave that lecture, what prompted you to feel the need to do so at that time?
So I can tell you, first of all, that lecture was part of a series. I was giving a series called Perspectives, in which I was giving each week a different perspective on an aspect from framework of Torah and Judaism, as I understood it, obviously. And the reason I included that lecture was because from the time that I arrived, and I had been here already for about 3.5, 4 years when I gave the lecture, every time, without fail, I'm not exaggerating, every time that I was in front of a 20 to 30-year-old audience, the question came up, Rabbi Dweck, what does the Torah say about homosexuality? Young people were saying to me, if I have a choice, and I'm not talking, fringe young people, I'm talking about Orthodox young people who were saying to me, if I have a choice between inclusivity and halacha, I'm going to choose inclusivity. And it was almost an onslaught. I constantly was getting this question in various forms, and not just by, young gay people, by heterosexual people who had friends or who were questioning just the nature of Judaism as a whole in terms of its perspective on this. So I said, okay, I'll give a shiur on it. I anticipated that there would probably be some pushback. I I did not anticipate at all the level of pushback, and that's saying it lightly, that came as a result of it in 3 different countries. But look, I still think that it's a very, very important issue, mainly because of the way that young people are looking to the Torah for its relevance to modern life. And at the time, and still now, I'm not sure how much it is, but at the time I felt that people just weren't addressing it. And so I attempted to, but would I have said things a bit differently now that I look back? Yes, but I do think that it was an important, and still is an important thing that needs addressing.
I listened to parts of it, and I appreciate what you said in that lecture. What I was once told that the best thing about Shabbat is that that's the time to give your lectures, because there's no recording of it.
Yeah.
But it is in the past, and the fact that you were willing to address it, and then when there were questions that rose afterwards, you were willing to clarify, is also to your great credit on it.
Yeah. I have to say, I will say, if you'll allow me, I don't know, how many people in America know about Dayan Chanoch Ehrentreu, may he be well and strong. Amen. He was extremely, without Dayan Ehrentreu, I think things would have ended very differently. So he to me, I've said, since the passing of Rabbi Vajja, there are few people who I recognize that level of gadlut in, like I do in Dayan Ehrentreu. And he just basically said to me, he said, look, we've got to take care of this. And he just did. And he kind of escorted me and walked with me through the entire thing. And to say I'm deeply grateful is an understatement, but he just is a tremendous gadol, and he was a tremendous source of strength and support during. Yeah.
And I guess that leads me to one more question I wanted to understand. I remember that in previous times, there was sometimes tension between the Beit Din and the Dayanim in the United Kingdom and the United Synagogue rabbis. Sometimes they weren't always on the same page. I know that Rabbi Mervis has worked very closely with them and I understand that things have gotten better. Who are the halachic experts, and how do they interact with the S&P Congress, Quila, and how are they interacting in general with the Rabbanim in England?
Sorry, again, it broke a little.
I know there's a problem.
Experts?
Who are the expert halachic, the expert halachic decisors in England today? Are they the Dayanim? And how are they interacting with Rabbanim, with the chief rabbi of the Svardic community, the chief rabbi of Ashkenazic community?
Right. All right. That's a great question, if I can say. So one of the interesting things, forgive me, but it's a great question, because that is a major dynamic here in the country, right? So, for example, one of the things that I noticed as an American coming into the country was that they call dayanim dayan, which is not really done anywhere else, right? So they don't call Dayan Ehrentreu Rabbi Ehrentreu. They call him Dayan Ehrentreu. One of the reasons for that was because Chief Rabbi Adler didn't want anybody else called rabbi except for the chief rabbi, and he said the dayanim should be called dayan, so that you should differentiate. But in any case, the dayanim, again, very centralized, right? Everything is very centralized. And so there aren't just kind of random poskim in the country that people go to. People are used to considering the dayanim essentially as the poskim. And they will go to a dayan and recognize the dayan is essentially a specialist in halacha, and they will ask the dayanim their opinion. And it is true that the Bet Din for example, the United Synagogue, or for that matter, my community, the Bet Din will often be the halachic decider and voice on inyanei halacha that are overreaching, right? In other words, questions about kashrut and Pesach and Shabbat, so on, people ask me, or anybody. But when it comes to halacha that has to do with policy or very serious issues, the Bet Din essentially still has a great deal of weight in this country. Our Bet Din, I like to say, is the oldest Bet Din in the country. We have documents from our Bet Din dating back to the 18th century, the early 18th century, which is phenomenal. I mean, it's really fascinating. And so yes, the dayanim. So it's a bit different between the community. So in my community, I appoint the dayanim as the chief rabbi. It's essentially ratified by the board, but I'm on paper the Av Bet Din, right? I'm officially the Av Bet Din, and so that means setting policy for the Bet Din and overseeing the work of the Bet Din and appointing dayanim. But the dayanim, for all intents and purposes, are the halachic authorities.
And how many dayanim do you have?
Currently, we have 4, but that's not a fixed. We had 3. In terms of the way things are, we happen to have.
And
the London Bet Din, the Ashkenazi Bet Din.
And the dayanim are generally trained in Israel or in England?
It depends. Some of the dayanim, our dayanim some were trained in England and some were trained in Israel. I think the London Bet Din, I think one might have even been trained in America, but both.
And while there is no concept among Svardim of modern Orthodox or Haredi, it's just Svardim. When we look at the dayanim, or you look at the rabbanim today in the Svardic Kihilot, are they still within that realm, or is there some or has it moved to the right, moved to the left, stayed in the center?
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly in the United Synagogue, which historically was very centrist, certainly has veered to the right, at least in the halachic nature of things, right? So the Bet Din is certainly leans much more to the right of things. My Bet Din, less so, and especially the Spanish-Portuguese community. The Spanish-Portuguese community has always been a very human-centered, pragmatic, centrist, kind of approach, very much in the spirit of the Rambam and old Andalusian Sfarad. So our Bet Din is more, I would say, more centrist. We work very closely with the London Bet Din, and we recognize, each other with great respect. And that's one of the things that is nice about London. Again, it's not as big as America. So we work together on a lot of things. The various communities and organizations work together, which I'm not necessarily used to coming from America. I mean, kind of in America, there's critical mass almost in every organization. Everybody kind of keeps to themselves more or less and does their thing. Here I work, cross-denominationally. I work interfaith. and certainly within the Orthodox world, we work very, very closely together. And that's something that I enjoy very much, which I just didn't have an experience in America.
No, it's interesting. Chicago has about 300,000 Jews.
Yeah,
And
great.
so
It puts it into perspective.
yeah, so I always think of the fact that Chicago is just an overgrown small town because we're able to interact, whether it's a Telz community or a modern Orthodox community or whatever, we all get along in one way or another. And in some ways, it sounds like Great Britain is the same. Rabbi, our time is up. I just want to thank you.
Already? I was
This
having
was a
so
lot of
much
fun.
fun. Thank you.
We may have to do a part 2 of this, but I want to thank
I would love to.
it's this, and by the way, this broadcast is also available as a podcast for those who want. You just look up Daytime Dialogues. And more importantly, I want to thank Matthew Miller of Congregation KINS for making the shidduch. He is a student of Rabbi Dweck, and I really appreciate him making this possible. So thank you so much.
Prince among men. He's a very, very special man.
Have a wonderful evening for you, and we're going to have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.